So I want to view this video as a continuation of the previous video. However, now instead of thinking about market power on the side of suppliers, we're going to think of market power on the side of those who are demanding, the consumers of whatever good or service may be in the market. And when that is the case, we no longer have a monopoly, we have a monopsony. And in this video, we're going to consider really one of the primary ways in which monopsonies create inefficiencies in our daily life. So as we're going to see in this video, monopsonies are going to be tied very closely when in the labor market to the minimum wage debate and to basically just the bargaining power and market forces in labor markets. So in your professional career, I believe that you need to be aware of the potential for monopsonistic labor markets so that you can make more efficient job hunting decisions. That if you want to understand what sort of compensation you are likely to receive from a particular job, it's not just a matter of supply and demand for your skills in that industry, in that job market. It's going to be a matter of the composition of the type of demand which you are facing. That yes, we need to understand how many other people with your set of skills are on the market, how many employers are out there, what the aggregate demand for your employment looks like, but also how many employers are there, and are they going to have excess market power to be able to negotiate a lower wage for you without you having any alternative. Similarly, if you're able to understand how monopsonies operate in labor markets, then you're going to be better informed regarding the debate over increases to the minimum wage. And I also want you to be eminently familiar with the fact that even though price floors are distortionary in perfectly competitive markets, when those assumptions fail, a price floor can actually increase efficiency if it's properly implemented. So before introducing you to how the minimum wage operates in a monopsonistic labor market, let's think about how monopsonies are related to monopolies. And I've provided up here this hint that they're opposites. So whereas we know that monopolists are only one producer of a good and monopsonists are only one consumer of a good, that's one way in which they're opposites. We also know that when we illustrate the supply and demand graph for monopolists, we add the marginal revenue curve, which is underneath the demand curve. When we draw the supply and demand graph for monopsonists, we're going to draw a new curve that's above the supply curve, and this is going to be the marginal expenditure curve. So for the sake of this conversation, it's going to be easier to think about monopsonists as being employers. We're going to think of them as, while there are monopsonists in the private goods markets for sure, it's going to be easier for this example if we think of the market for labor instead of the market for goods. And remember, those that are demanding labor are employers. And so when there's a monopsonist and they're the only employer in town, let's say you live in a company town and there's only one particular employer for your set of skills, then that monopsonist can determine how many people it wants to hire based on what wage, what salary they would have to pay all of their employees. That if they were just to hire one employee, or that marginal amount of labor, then they could get by with paying them. So the price here, we'll use a wage here, call it wage one. They could get by with paying them a relatively low wage. However, if they tried to pay that wage to everybody, then nobody else would work. It would not be worth the time of other possible employees to work for that marginal benefit that they would receive from the wage. and that the marginal cost of their time would be greater than the marginal benefit which they could receive from the wage. So if an employer wants to hire more people, if a monopsonist wants to increase the quantity of labor which they can hire, they need to increase the wage which they offer. And so they make this decision in accordance with when their marginal expenditure on employees, how much they're spending on each additional employee, is going to equal the marginal benefit of each additional employee, which is going, in this case, to be the marginal revenue which each employee is going to bring to the company. So remember that even though this is determining the marginal, the monopsonist quantity of labor which they're hiring, which we'll call QM, they're not going to pay them that high of a wage because they know that those employees are going to be willing to work the quantity supplied at QM. They're going to be willing to work for wage M, where that quantity intersects the supply of labor curve. So hopefully, again, now you can see how this would differ from a world of perfect competition in labor markets, that we are hiring too few people and we're paying them too little, that the equilibrium wage here, this P naught, is greater than the monopsonist wage, and that we have this deadweight loss, that we could have a more efficient outcome if we could get more people to work and pay them more. So now we're going to think about how we can use government price regulations as a way to achieve that more efficient outcome. So to show how the minimum wage story changes when employers are monopsonistic instead of perfectly competitive, let's once again illustrate our marginal expenditure curve. Consider where our monopsonistic levels of employment would be, QM, now what wage they would be paid, WM. So now let's remember that minimum wage laws are only going to be distortionary, or only going to lead to inefficient outcomes in perfectly competitive markets if they're placed above the equilibrium wage, above what would be P naught in this case. So let's say that we now have a minimum wage which is going to be given here. We'll call this wage, minimum wage, or WMW. So how would this minimum wage impact the employment decisions of monopsonists? Well, this minimum wage becomes the least amount that employers can pay their employees up until for them to work a given job. So employers are only going to, they want to pay this down here. However, they can't, they have to pay this, to pay the minimum wage, and they're going to do that just like they do when there's not a minimum wage. They make that decision how many employees to hire based on where their minimum marginal expenditure curve intersects the demand curve, where it intersects the marginal benefit or marginal revenue curve. And so at that point in time, this marginal expenditure takes a jump up to here, but up until that, the marginal expenditure curve is the minimum wage. And so if employers are going to make rational, profit maximizing decisions in response to the minimum wage, then they are going to demand Q, call this MW, units of labor, and they're going to pay them that minimum wage. So WMW. So in this case, the minimum wage would actually reduce the deadweight loss. That when there is not a minimum wage, deadweight loss is everything to the right of that green dashed line. And after the minimum wage law, it's going to be everything to the right of the blue dashed line. So we've essentially reduced deadweight loss by all of that yellow triangle that you can now see. And that has been returned to consumers and producers as consumer surplus and producer surplus. So this is how we can use price controls from the government as a way to regulate market power in some industries and create more efficient outcomes. So before concluding our discussion of market failures and how they lead to less efficient outcomes than what we would expect under perfectly competitive markets, I want to discuss how prevalent this degree of concentration in labor markets is throughout the US. And so what you see here is a map of all the labor markets in the US as defined by the commuting sheds for certain jobs. So obviously this is pretty large in places out west in like rural Nevada, and very small in densely populated areas such as Minnesota. Over here would be a good example. So, or in Minneapolis. So this legend here is telling us that the red means that there are extremely concentrated market power, meaning there's very few employers for each set of skills, for each type of job. And that when it's unconcentrated, when it's green, it means that this is maybe closer to a perfectly competitive employer. So we can see that throughout most of the US, there is a high degree of market power, which is in the hands of employers, that they can essentially act as monopsonists and charge individuals, be willing to pay individuals a lower wage than they would be able to get in perfectly competitive markets. So what does this mean for policy? It means that minimum wage laws are going to be more effective than they otherwise would be, that we could probably argue more effectively for raises and hikes to the minimum wage, and that you should be aware as an employer that, or as an employee, that when you go looking for a job, that many of the markets in which you're looking may be likely to not be perfectly competitive, and the wage that you'll be paid will be a product of that. So this concludes our discussion of market failures. And the last video for this week, I just want to briefly go over how we calculate elasticities as a way to kind of tie together all the loose ends with our discussion of supply and demand and be able to move on to discussing macroeconomics.